Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, Todd Cochrane.
All right, welcome everyone. Todd Cochrane here, the host of the Smart Business Revolution podcast. And if you've listened to this before, you know that I get to talk with smart, amazing, interesting CEOs, founders, entrepreneurs of all kinds of different companies and organizations every week, like YPO, EO, Activation Blizzard, Lending Tree, OpenTable, Axe Software, and many more. I feel it's such a privilege to get to talk to these people. Today is no exception. I'm also the co-founder of Rise 25, where we help connect B2B business owners to their ideal prospects. And I'm excited today because my guest is a podcasting legend. His name is Rob Greenlee. He's a seasoned veteran, expert, and evangelist for the industry. And in fact, just a couple of years ago in 2017, inductee into the Academy of Podcasters Hall of Fame. Spent many years also focused on the early development of the internet, World Wide Web, and technology with a nationally syndicated radio show called WebTalk World Radio Show, which started back in 1999 and went through about 2006. He's also the chairperson of a relatively newer organization called the Podcast Academy, which we'll talk about that as well, and the Podcast Academy Awards at thepodcastacademy.com, and co-host of the New Media Show, newmediashow.com with Todd Cochrane, spelled slightly differently from my last name. I think I'm pronouncing that right. CEO of Blubrry Podcasting. He's also the VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn, which I've been a customer of for 10 years or so. So we're going to dive into that. Before we get into this episode, though, this episode is brought to you by Rise 25 Media. And look, I don't need to tell you the world has changed, and I'm not just talking about the pandemic, but the question is, the world has changed. What do we do about it? And in this economy, it's more important than ever to be able to connect and build strong relationships with clients, referral partners, strategic partners, even when you can't be face-to-face. And it's something I've been doing for 10 plus years. I tell everyone they should do it. And at Rise 25, we have 20 years of experience in the B2B podcasting space, connecting and building profitable relationships with clients, referral partners, and strategic partners using a podcast. We've helped hundreds of B2B businesses to do the same thing, getting more clients, referral partners, and land collaborations with dream clients. So if you want to learn more about that, go to rise25media.com, or you can also email us at support@rise25media.com. All right, Rob, it's such a pleasure to have you here. And, you got started with web radio back in 1999 or so, in the 90s?
Correct.
Okay, and I have to start with this first question. You must have seen where everything is going. Perfect, clear vision. You knew that this is where we're going to be here today, right?
Oh yeah, totally. No, I mean it's had a little bit of a roller coaster ride, but I'll just say that well, it's great to be here, John. Thanks for the invite, but it's great. The path and the journey that this medium has followed, because it hasn't always been publicly a smooth ride. It's been a little bumpy through the years. During like the midpoint of the industry, probably around 2008 to 2010, that's when social media really took off, right? Facebook, Twitter, and it kind of took away the attention that podcasting had garnered in the earlier part of the decade, in 2004 to 2007. So, it's had its ups and downs, but steadily, if you look at the data on listeners and content, it's steadily grown every year. So
yeah, and it's funny because I heard you mention that on another podcast interview about how 2007, 2008, people started getting infatuated with Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of these larger companies that had gone into podcasting came out of podcasting
kind
and
of
started
dropped out, right?
put their resources into social media. But if you look at the numbers, if you look at awareness, all the different stats that they track around podcasting, downloads, listenership, how many people had listened to a podcast before, how many people knew the word podcasting, all those different stats, it's been this steady climb over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's that's what's really kept my enthusiasm for the medium, because I always figured if I could just last it, if I could stay in the medium long enough, we would get there eventually. But it certainly has not been a hockey stick rise in the development of podcasting. It's been a long haul. So, and it's had its ups and downs. More of the ups and downs have been around exposure of the medium itself, like in the news and the media and things like that, and the attention that the medium has gotten has been variable. And that's what's given people this perception that the industry's had its roller coaster ride, when it's really, if you look at the actual numbers, it really has been pretty steady.
Right. So talk, for someone who's listening to this and listens to podcasts and they're curious about the industry, maybe even thinking about getting involved in it at some point, which I've been telling for 10 years since I started, I've been telling everyone they need to do it because it's just, you get such tremendous value. Talk about some of the pros and cons to getting involved with the industry now. Of course, if you talk to someone, they'll say, well, is it too late, right? Is it too late now for me to get involved? I wish I'd started 10 years ago. But I say to people, well, one of the pros is people know what a podcast is now. 10 years ago, you had to explain to people how to do it. It was really hard to download an episode. Now it's like it's getting baked into cars and it's easier to listen to them on your phone. So talk about some of those pros and cons of getting involved in the industry now.
Yeah, I think there's kind of a complex way of looking at it. I think that, sure, there's a lot more podcasts out there than there were in the early days of the medium. But I also think, like you were just saying, there's a lot more listeners, there's a lot more awareness. And I think that there's still genres of content out there that really haven't been fully, developed, and as far as audiences and things. And as we see more diversity come into podcasting is reaching into areas that are exactly a mirror reflection of the world's population and the diversity of the world's population. And so it's really continuing to grow and develop, and it's not too late to get involved in the medium. But I think with the numbers comes a certain amount of responsibility to new content creators and ones that are currently creating content to kind of a little bit up their game a little bit around quality, around value that they're delivering to their audiences and their production qualities. I think in the early days of the medium, we were a little bit more constricted by bandwidth and those kind of things that really limited our ability to really fully go after the quality aspects of podcasting. But if you think about this medium as an intimate medium where people listen very, very much intentionally, it's a medium that has so much potential to connect with people at a very deep level that you do have a responsibility to create that listening experience. Right. And I think that's the key thing, that is pleasant and it's enjoyable and it's fun and it's not painful to listen to, right? Or it's not full of value. And I think that's the shift that we've seen. We've shifted to quality, and we've shifted to value. And and when I talk about quality, that's the spectrum of actual audio quality, video quality, and just production quality. And I think those are the elements that we're moving into. And it's a little bit why I got involved in the Podcast Academy, was to develop the professionalism of this medium at all levels. And I'm just not talking about just the big companies of podcasting that need to do this. I'm talking about all levels of podcasting. And I think never before in the past have we had inexpensive tools to enable quality productions than we have today.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. I totally agree with you on there's certain ways that it's so much easier to improve your quality now. For example, you can buy a microphone easily on Amazon. It's delivered 2 days later. It'll really improve the quality of your sound. You shouldn't be recording on a phone in a kitchen where it's echoey, or in your car or something like that. Right. Sometimes there's really poor. So there's like kind of simple things you can do. But on the other hand, I talk to people all the time who, they're a big fan of How I Built This, or they're a big fan of This American Life. And they're like, I want to do a show like This American Life. And I'm like, good luck to you. I mean, what's your budget, right? So people are kind of comparing themselves to these really, deep budgeted productions out there. And even TV companies like Tenderfoot Media are jumping into podcast production, and they're producing amazing shows, which I love listening to. But it's hard to compare yourself to that, especially if you're a larger guy or if you're just getting started. So what do you say to people that are interested in getting started in the industry, but they're a bit intimidated by the quality that's out there?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the genre and what you're doing and what your expectations are and what your goals are, what you're trying to accomplish with the show. I think that your example of these high production values of like Tenderfoot TV or Wondery or some of these, those are very specific, usually true crime type podcasts. They're very journalistic. They have big teams behind them that they're developing and funding and things like that. But really, those type of programs are not the core of podcasting. The core of podcasting is shows like we're doing, John. I mean, these are genuine conversations, shows that are comedy programs, ones that are out there sharing and building community are really the backbone of the industry. And I think most people have the ability to start a program. It may not be great to start with, but it's consistency of production, it's consistency of trying to get better and learning and growing and building those connections with people are what really make a podcaster successful. And that doesn't actually happen overnight. So it's something that you have to be very committed to, and you have to work hard at every day. I mean, I've been doing a variety of different podcasts myself over the 16 years that I've been involved in this medium, and it's okay to pod fade and start something new. I'm in the middle of trying to come up with something new myself. So it's always, what have you done most recently sometimes is what's important out there and learning and growing. And I think that you can grow your career, you can grow a business, you can grow all sorts of stuff in this podcasting medium. So I think that the opportunities are still strong out there.
I heard you say on another podcast that about 50% of the audience out there is listening to independent shows and 50% are listening to these larger shows out there, which I was pleasantly surprised to hear that, since I come from the independent world. And for me, for many years podcasting, what was most interesting was these independent productions, or someone who wouldn't otherwise be producing something, doesn't have a big budget behind it. So talk a little bit about that, how that metric has changed, or what the landscape looks like now in terms of independent versus larger productions.
Well, that number that you're quoting came from the Edison Research folks. They did a study on the share of ear and what people are actually listening to out there, and what programs out there, what big networks are actually seeing the most connections with listeners on a frequency basis. And so you are seeing a fairly even split between those listening to what would be considered big media shows and ones that are independent, like this show and the show that Todd Cochrane and I do twice a week. I mean, they're just talk shows essentially, but they're very much grassroots type of programs, and so I think that distribution of 50-50 between those two sides of the medium is pretty healthy. I mean, I think it is. I mean, the bigger budget productions are going to tend to grab a significant portion of people's interest. National Public Radio, I mean, look how popular that is, and it's been a backbone of the podcasting industry for many years. Though if you look at the sheer numbers of shows coming out of public radio, it's pretty small. So the vast majority of the shows in the podcasting meeting are independent produced programs,
right?
Those may not have in any individual standpoint as big of an audience as like This American Life or those kind of things, but they in total they add up to a lot of unique listeners.
Yeah. And one of the messages I want to share with people is that you don't have to compete with those larger productions, the NPRs of the world and stuff like that. And if you try, it's going to be really difficult. But having said that, since you brought up NPR, I think it's a great point. I think I read recently that they were estimating that this year their advertising revenue from podcasting was going to eclipse terrestrial radio, which is really amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was their vision of what might happen, and why public radio has really embraced podcasting is that they were seeing that radio listener was aging on them, and that they were seeing podcasting was a younger demographic. So they were seeing their future being more on the digital side as you look to the future and the radio side would probably over the decades kind of fade a little bit. So it was a very much a kind of, I think, a long-term survival tactic. And podcasting is very much compatible with that sponsorship model that public radio has. And I think podcasting has learned a lot from public radio, and radio has learned a lot from public radio. And I'm talking about commercial radio too. Though I think that there's a lot of economic pressure on commercial radio to replicate the revenue that's been generated on the commercial radio side for many years. That is, they're finding it more difficult to do that than they had for many years on the commercial broadcast radio side. So trying to replicate that revenue in podcasting in commercial radio is a little bit more of a challenge. I mean, just think of it from an advertising load standpoint. I mean, radio has had 16 minutes of ads per hour of commercial load, and podcasting, you really shouldn't venture past maybe 4 or 5 minutes in an hour of advertisement. So you can see a little bit of an imbalance for commercial radio. Yeah,
and I mean, truthfully, when it comes to advertising, listeners have a completely different level of expectation, right? In radio, you expect advertising. And, one of the top complaints you hear from podcast listeners is they don't like listening to ads. I was listening to a Joe Rogan episode recently, and the first 8.5 minutes was ads. And the other thing is, I just skipped through all of it, but I was shocked by the fact that the first 8.5 minutes was like 17 different ads.
Yeah, it's like what all of us did for many years with television, is that you could always hit that fast forward button,
right? And
I think that's unfortunate that that's happening in podcasting in some ways. I mean, if you look back to the very origins of podcasting, it was a reaction to over commercialization of radio. Is why one of the big reasons why podcasting was something that got off the ground, is that it was like kill radio was the theme of the early days of podcasting, and stick it to the man, and we're not going to be commercialized. That's really what the motto was of this medium. And I fear that some of the commercial interests in the medium are pushing us back towards that commercial model again. And while I think that there's a place in that side of the industry at a certain level, I think there is a cap to that before we start getting back into the pushback that happened against commercial radio. So
there are some interesting models that are coming out there. Of course, one of the big gorillas on the block right now is Spotify, which has gone into podcasting in a major way.
Right.
They've had a lot of major acquisitions. They also have some ads within their app where it's a visual ad in addition to an audible ad. So that's interesting. And, some people say that they're trying to build like a Netflix of podcasting. So that would be a different revenue source. So let's talk a little bit about the impact that Spotify's big wave headline grabbing changes and moves have impacted the industry.
Well, Spotify got involved in podcasting many years ago, actually. I mean, it's been a long journey for them getting in the medium, and it wasn't always a easy pathway. They didn't get it right in the early days. I mean, they've been trying to get into podcasting for probably at least 5 years now. So it's been quite a journey, and I've worked with them quite a bit at the two companies that I've worked with on the podcast hosting side. I was with Spreaker in the past, and worked a lot with Spotify when I was at Spreaker, and then with Libsyn now. But in the early days, Spotify just really didn't know what they were doing with it. I mean, it was really they were relying on a lot of the podcast hosting platforms to submit shows to them on spreadsheets in the early days. And it was really kind of a difficult process. And they were being picky with what shows were going to, and they were trying to figure out if they were going to create a advertising model around podcasting and all that stuff in the very early days. And it just, they launched it for a while, and then they had a change of staff leadership, and they stopped pursuing it, and then they jumped back into it again. So Spotify's had a very much of a spotty effort in embracing the podcasting space. And quite honestly, for many years, because of what I saw with Spotify, I was very skeptical in the early days whether or not the streaming music platforms were going to be able to do it, pull it off, get involved in podcasting. I mean, because if you go back and you look at the origins of the medium, if you look at iTunes supporting podcasting, or in the early days, I worked for Zune, which had a music platform as well that added podcasts that I was involved in helping get off the ground. And those were music platforms primarily. So I kind of always thought that the merger between these music streaming platforms and podcasting would eventually happen. I just was, I wasn't sure how they were going to pull it off, because I kind of always thought that the listening to music and the listening to podcasting were kind of two different things, right? And trying to blend them together into one experience didn't seem to make a lot of sense. And when I talked to the music streaming platforms, they were like, yeah, we don't see how it's gonna work, because I mean, most of the people that worked at the music streaming platforms were just music people, right? They were like hardcore music people, and they just didn't see the connection between the two. And that's been my experience in the past too. But Spotify has come in and really kind of, played around with the models and tried to come up with, taking the advice of people like myself and others in the medium to make changes to what they were doing, bring in more shows, get more content in there. And when the podcast community heard that Spotify was going to open it up to everybody instead of having the hosts submit their shows by spreadsheet, then the whole thing exploded, and everybody got all excited about getting into Spotify, because Spotify was reaching a little bit of a different demographic audience. It was reaching a younger listener base, which podcasting needed. Podcasting was, in the early days of the medium, was leaning a little bit on the older side. It was meeting it was mainly getting listened to by people that were over 35. But then when Spotify started to come into the medium, we started to see the age group of listeners start to go down into the 20s. And now we're kind of moving into the teens now. And that's been a big shift. And I do believe Spotify is one of the key catalysts that has basically got that off the ground. So, but Spotify is trying to do some things that are unique. I don't know that there will ever be a Netflix of podcasting out there. I think it's a term that's been described out there. And if you look at all the companies that have tried, they've all pretty much failed in doing that.
Yeah, I mean, another one is, Sirius XM that recently acquired Stitcher. So maybe they're trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, well, the Pandora, Sirius XM, and Stitcher now, that company is, I think they've got some decisions to make. I mean, I've been working with Pandora and those folks for off and on for a few years now, as they've kind of tiptoed around podcasting, and they may come at this a little bit differently than what we've seen with Spotify. So they are a U.S. Only companies at this point. Now that may change with the acquisition that they just made, because Stitcher is a global podcast listening app. So that may shift their emphasis into getting their content out on a global scale versus the Pandora platform, which has primarily been US based. But they may come into the market with a little different model around advertising, and they may be the ones that kind of push the envelope on advertising and podcasting and working directly with content creators around all that. So we shall see. I think that the jury's still out. The company acquired a lot of podcasting assets when they bought Stitcher, and we shall see how that all sorts out with their internal efforts around satellite radio and their other properties that they have, like Pandora. So it's still a project in progress, is what I'll say on it. That's about all I can say on it, really.
Yeah, it's really interesting, though. These companies, I'm sure if I'm serious, I'm thinking, podcasting could be a major threat to your business, and you don't want to be like Kodak, where digital photography comes along and you didn't adapt and you go out of business. Another big company that has been making moves inward, coming from a different direction, is Amazon with their Audible app. So here you have your Audible app, which is mostly audiobooks, and they've been moving towards podcasts, bringing podcasts, making that app more of a podcast player. So that's interesting too, slightly different from what Spotify is doing, coming from the music world. So talk a little bit about those moves.
Well, I think if there was going to be a Netflix of podcasting, I would say Audible is probably the best candidate for that. considering what they've been doing for many, many years. I would say Audible is really a pioneer in the premium audio space. They really led the charge with audiobooks, and they've dabbled into podcasting off and on over the years. And the problem with Audible, I mean, it's not a problem, but just the inherent friction in Audible between what they've done with the audiobooks and what podcasting is that Audible is a very proprietary platform, right? So it's had subscription-based paid content access, and podcasting is an open medium, right? Freely distributed, typically no paid subscription linked to it. And so in some ways, podcasting conflicted with their business model. So, but they've tried to get involved in podcasting over the years, even using the term podcast to describe shows that were only available in the proprietary platform of Audible, which was a little bit of wasn't the correct referential terminology, which I think they've moved away from now. I think now it's called Audible Originals now, which is not using the term podcast anymore. So, but they have had some external podcasts. But what's new and what's happening now is the Amazon company, which owns Audible, is getting into having their own podcast catalog. So, and if you think about how that might extend out to Alexa, the smart speaker platform, and I'm sorry if I triggered your smart speaker. I do that sometimes.
It happens all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So
actually, I think the host on another episode you were doing an interview on spelled it out, ALEX.
Right.
Which is probably smart.
Yeah. So that catalog is going to really help that smart speaker platform develop into something better, because they've been relying on iHeartRadio and TuneIn as their source of podcast content on the smart speaker platform for Amazon. And both of those catalogs are incomplete and not the best kind of user experience from a vocal command kind of thing, because they built their own apps and things like that. So
yeah, actually, I have a 9-year-old who loves podcasts. He listens to the Wow in the World podcast. Guy Raz from NPR does, and he constantly complains to me in the evening. He wants to listen to this podcast, but he doesn't want to listen to it on the smart speaker because it's a bad experience. Exactly what you're describing. He can't go back in the catalog where it's really difficult to do. So he's always asking for my phone so he can listen to the podcast on the phone instead.
Right. Well, it's also, I think, one of the friction areas too, and I think some have tried to say that this is not as big of a factor, but podcasting tends to be a one-to-one medium, and a smart speaker tends to be kind of like a one-to-many type of experience, which I think over time is going to change, because that platform is evolving into becoming what's called a smart agent technology platform, which means that the back-end software and the technology that is going to cater to individual needs over the long term, right? So that service could be installed on your phone, it could be in your car, it could be on your refrigerator, that account may travel with you while you travel and you go on trips and stuff, and those type of listening platforms might be able to recognize your voice and access your account. So you're kind of, it's a little bit of a future-looking kind of experience of what is possible there. And I was really excited to see Amazon, and I'd been encouraging Amazon for years now to add podcasts to their Amazon Music offering, and now they're actually starting to do it. It hasn't been launched yet, but they are gathering content. So if you're a podcaster and you host on Libsyn, you can submit your podcast over to Amazon.
That's great.
So and then they'll be launching that at some point in the future. But that's the effort that we're doing right now, is trying to get as much content into the Amazon directory as we can prior to their launch.
Right. You brought up a great point that I want to circle back to, which is about the fundamental structure of podcasting, and without getting too wonky, people talk all the time, or they think about like, oh, I might start a podcast, or I might start a YouTube show, or I might do an Instagram show or something. And social media is just fundamentally structured differently. Podcasting, to me, is more like real estate ownership. You own your feed, which can go to multiple different places.
Right.
Versus if you build a YouTube channel, which is owned by Google, Google changes the rules of the road. You have to comply. You've got no other thing you can do about it. And so all your eggs are in one basket. So talk about that fundamental structural difference, because I think that's such a critical distinction for people to understand.
Yeah, I think if you think about the web and the internet just in general, we've seen the growth and development of proprietary platforms. Like I think YouTube is a great example of it. Facebook is a good example of it. Twitter, you just go through the list. And if you go back in the early days of the web and the internet, there was America Online, which was, to many people, was the internet back then, because most people didn't experience anything in web browsers outside of AOL. So what we're seeing with podcasting is an open medium, which means that it's available really on all sorts of proprietary platforms, but it's also available outside of any proprietary platform, right? In a web player, on a browser, or on a mobile app, or one that doesn't require login, right? So content access is freely available. There's RSS feeds that have linked to the MP3 files. So there is a layer of podcasting that is not constrained by a proprietary listening platform. So sure, the industry has embraced proprietary listening platforms like Spotify and now Pandora and others out there that have login experiences, right? And maybe have premium content in there and are building layers of monetization in those platforms. But that's the structural difference with podcasting, is that it's an open standard-based medium. And there really isn't any other open standard-based medium that exists out there that has grown to the scale that podcasting has on a global scale. TV, movies, music, all that stuff, and audiobooks is all sitting behind passwords on proprietary platforms. So that's what's really unique about podcasting.
Right. Thank you for explaining that. I think that's an important distinction, and kind of a related concept. I think you kind of touched on it, but some people talk about kind of the limits to the way that the feed was originally built. And I'm getting really over my head really quickly here because I'm not an expert in these things. But like, for example, some people will say that the podcasting experience doesn't integrate other features such as social, like discussions and stuff like that. Kind of in the way that, like, if you're on Twitter, people have discussions and threaded discussions and things like that, or on Facebook, and that's not built into the fundamental structure of RSS feeds, which were built 20 plus years ago.
Right.
So talk a little bit about those limitations, and is there anything we can do about it at this point, or is it kind of like rebuilding the plane when it's flying at 30,000 feet?
Well, I think it's one of those examples of be careful what you wish for, because I think what podcasting has enabled is a lot of different companies to jump in and offer technology layers to podcasting that is separate from the RSS, right? So though I must qualify that and say that there may be some efforts and some desires within the industry to add more extensions to RSS, to add more capability and functionality to what is supplied from content creators to proprietary platforms or other open listening platforms. So I think the jury is still out on whether or not we're going to extend RSS into other features and functions and capabilities. But I must say that if you talk to any of the purists in the medium, they will tell you that don't make things overly complex when it comes to the fundamentals of podcasting, because it kind of limits the opportunities that could be created by other companies, startups, or whatever that can add layers to this that maybe are not directly linked to RSS. So RSS is it's one of those things that you have to be careful. If you tamper with it too much, you might break it.
Hence why I don't get involved in that stuff.
Right. I mean, it's just one of those things. I mean, a lot of companies have jumped in and added what they call namespaces, which Apple did very early in the medium, where they basically add their own list of tags. Now, when I say tags, that's a area in the XML document that asks for certain metadata, right, or links to different resources, or tags, or descriptions, or titles, or just metadata to populate a user experience, right? So you could add a layer into the RSS feed that adds functionality like sharing data on guest bios and guest photos, or you could add layers of links to donation models. You could add all these layers that can add a deeper experience coming out of RSS into listening platforms. But what we've seen is that the listening platforms typically want to add that layer. And if you're pushing your layer onto their layer, which layer are they going to support, right? And that's always been the pushback, is that is everyone going to support any new tags that are added to RSS? And that's one of the reasons Todd Cochrane and I, with the New Media Show, we started a little bit of a group called the RSS Coalition, which is trying to bring together all of the listening apps to say, okay, we want to extend RSS. What does everybody want? And will you, Stitcher, or you, Apple, support it, right? Is it something that will pass through? Is it worth us adding to RSS for it to be an experience in the listening platforms, right? And
what's the state of that? Was there any consensus on changes?
Yeah, I think we had some general things, but the thing that Todd and I learned from it is that it's a very difficult conversation, because it may or may not limit what those individual proprietary listening apps might want to add to their platforms. I mean, if we're integrating in with a third-party technology company to provide some data source in there, then they're forced to work with somebody that maybe they don't want to work with. So it's a complex issue, and sometimes it's just better to keep things simple.
Yeah. That makes sense. Now, I can't believe I'm asking about all the exciting new ones on the block, right? The Spotify's, the Sirius XMs, but you brought up Apple, which is still the biggest gorilla out there, depending on who you believe. Different statistics. I've heard that between 50% and 70% of all the downloads are going through Apple. So share with us a little bit your observations of what Apple is doing that is affecting the podcasting industry. And, is there anything coming down the block that they're doing that's affecting podcasters today?
Well, Apple has been a good steward of podcasting over the years. I think they faced probably some fairly unfair criticism over the years, because maybe the perception is they didn't invest in podcasting in the early days a lot to make it bigger, or make it more successful, or add monetization, or maybe their apps weren't as good as what people would have liked. So Apple has faced some criticism over the years, but at the end of the day, when you look at what Apple has done, if we didn't have Apple supporting podcasting, we wouldn't be where we are right now. So with the scale and the amount of shows and the amount of listeners that are engaged in the medium, because they are a source of, from a directory perspective. I mean, if you submit to Apple, you actually get your show into not just Apple, but you get it into like maybe a dozen other listening apps out there, because a lot of the other listening apps source all their shows out of an API that Apple provides to the industry for a bunch of smaller listening apps. So in some ways, Apple has been, very supportive of some innovation and some other players in the medium that want to come in and build an app. And Apple likes to encourage app development because they have an app marketplace, right? So it's been a great relationship. I've known the Apple staff for many, many years. I mean, even the staff prior to the staff that's there now. I mean, there's been a complete changeover over the years of people that work over there on the podcasting area. But I can tell you, over the last 2 or 3 years, they've been adding more people to their Apple podcasting staff than I've ever seen them in the past. So they are heavily investing. They have a new guy that's in charge of global podcasting now. And there's all sorts of business development people. There's technology people, people that are helping people in the industry. They started a new content initiative at the company to create original podcast content that would be available on their platform. So they're getting in the content game now too, which they have off and on done that over the years as well. But Apple's one of those platforms that still supports video podcasting too. And I know you had expressed an interest in talking about that too.
Yeah. Well, that's another big question that people ask about is, should I do a video podcast? Should I do an audio one? What are the differences between the two? So share with us your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the video podcasting side has evolved over the years. If you think back to the early days of the medium in the 2007 to probably 9 timeframe, there was a lot of, even going back further, even back to the 2005 timeframe, there was a fair amount of video podcasts that were created and uploaded as like an MP4 file, to the RSS feed, just like what you see with audio today. And so I would say about 25% of the market was video podcasts in the early days of the medium. And then after YouTube launched and started to grow its user base, people started shifting their video podcasting over to YouTube because it was free hosting. Because typically podcasters had to pay for more storage and maybe some bandwidth to deliver video files. When it's a lot easier to deliver audio, those files are a lot smaller, and the storage that it requires to store those files is a lot less. So people started shifting over to doing everything on YouTube, and that's what caused the video podcasting space to erode. So I think we're down to like 5% of the podcasting market is video podcasts now, considering it started at about 25%. But Apple is one of the few platforms that still supports video podcasting. And the show that I do, the new media show that I do with Todd Cochrane, is available as a video podcast, and it's an 1.5-hour video file, which is I think it's like a 1.5 terabyte or something like that. It's big.
Yeah. So what I actually changed to doing, my business partner has done a video podcast for the entire time he's done a podcast. Jeremy Weiss has been about 10 years and he's done it video. And I think he might have used different hosting platforms. Now he uploads it to YouTube, same as I. So we upload it to YouTube and we basically embed it in a post on our website. But the reason that I started doing that about a year ago, after only doing audio prior to that, was because I'd heard so many people saying they listened to podcasts in YouTube and they didn't care that much about the video. They just were like walking around the house or whatever, and they would put it on and they'd listen to it through YouTube.
Well, yeah, and you're seeing now the shift from Google Play Music over to YouTube Music. So I think you're seeing that shift happen right now too, as YouTube recognizes that people are listening to a lot of music on that platform as well. They're watching video versions of music, right? Just like what's happening in the podcasting realm. And I think there's a lot of people listening to podcasts over at YouTube. But I think it does tend to skew towards shorter podcasts and ones that cater to a younger audience, is what's popular over there.
Yeah. We've danced around this a little bit, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, but I want to ask directly about the listener experience and the different apps that are out there right now, because I have read and I've listened to some criticisms that there are some ways that it could be improved. Are there any ways that you see different apps, podcasting apps, that are improving the experience now? Or are there any ways in which you've thought of that companies should be improving the listener's experience from a listener's perspective and using an app and discoverability and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I think what we've seen over the last couple of years, as we've seen the bigger players, some of the other bigger players get in the medium like Spotify and Google Podcasts, is that we've kind of gone backwards a little bit on usability of podcasting. And when I say backwards, back to a much more simpler experience. I think we went through a phase with like an Overcast app and some of the Pocket Cast and some of the ones that have been around for a long time that have spent a lot of years adding a lot of advanced features and functionality to the listening experience, start to pull back a little bit and try and make the experience a little bit simpler. And I think part of it has to do with the shift over to kind of the perception of just click play consumption of podcasting versus the subscribe, download, and listen later model, which has been the predominant model of podcasting for most of the life of the medium. So we're basically simplifying. If you look at Spotify today, it's just a list of episodes and click play. That's how things have changed now. Now, I believe Google Podcast just rolled out the ability to, once you've logged into your Google account in the browser, it will start storing your subscriptions, right, or things that you've favorited in there. So I think that there's some basic functionality in there. But I think what we've seen is that the industry has kind of pulled back on advanced features and functions in the listening apps for the simple reason is that we're trying to reach scale. We're trying to reach listeners that maybe are not what would be considered to be kind of advanced listeners or podcast listening geeks, whatever. We're trying to mainstream it, right? And part of the path to mainstreaming it is to simplify the experience. And then we've seen the bigger platforms, Google, Spotify, Pandora, and Apple, taking full transcripts of all the episodes that they have in their platform to create better search indexing and search results to help people discover and find podcasts that's relevant to them. Though I don't know that the Apple has fully deployed that yet, but I do believe that all these platforms are building that database of deep contextual information about what's actually in the content. And there will be some benefit that comes out of that, whether or not freely available transcripts of the audio that's included in there. I mean, if you think about Google would love to get access to a textual based reference to episodes, right? Just for their search index. So that's the other big direction that we're seeing in the industry right now too, is getting deep context into the content itself that can generate better discovery process for listeners.
Yeah. Well, right now I've done transcripts for a while for my show, and I encourage everyone to do it because, if you put it up on your website, that helps tremendously. You get 3,000 to 5,000 words, keyword rich words on your website. So it helps with SEO value. But that's a great point that you make about also adding the value and the discoverability within the apps themselves, which is where a lot of people are discovering shows. I want to shift now to asking you about the Academy of Podcasters, and why you decided to get involved in that, and what your goals are for it. You're the chair now, correct?
Yeah. Well, I've only been the chair since March. The organization was started back in February. And it was really led at that point by Hernan Lopez, who is the CEO of Wondery. And so he's the one, he's still on the board and still active in the organization around the awards. But I got involved in the organization just because I saw what was being developed there. And I think it was a huge opportunity for the medium. And I wanted to contribute my years of experience to that group, that the founding board members, which a lot of them haven't been around the medium very long, so they had a very kind of short window of exposure to what the medium was all about. So I got involved, hopefully, to try and make sure that the independent producer side was well represented in the goals and the initiatives of the organization. And the goals of the organization are really, at this point, are fairly simplistic, and because we have to start somewhere, and that is to build an Academy of Podcast Awards type of process that can be like maybe a global podcast awards that rewards excellence in content production and talent, and from hosts to the content producers, editing, kind of like what you envision with the the film industry with the Academy Awards, right? It's the same type of thinking process, is that we're thinking of ourselves as a content medium now more than ever. So it makes sense to reward terrific content that comes from all levels of content creators, and get that, build that as a member organization, which means that individuals that are working at these companies and hosting these podcasts are the backbone of this academy. And we're all helping each other, mentoring each other. We're sharing knowledge. We're doing webinars. We're doing educational initiatives, and we're basically pulling together awards that can get attention for this medium on a global scale, or at least in the U.S. to get started with here. And so we're going to have an award ceremony coming up in 2021 that we're going to recognize some terrific podcasters and podcasting, and then have webinars and initiatives around education and mentoring and things like that in the meantime. And then hopefully what I'm building as well is maybe some standards bodies that can come out of this organization that can help on some of the things we had talked about earlier, which is extensions to RSS, maybe more technical standards around advertising and monetization models. Maybe the medium needs like a professional, to some degree, a professional organization that can help with these things and train new editors and new producers and new directors, and I mean all these things that are key to a content industry, and that's really the goals of the organization. So we are open for membership right now. That opened up on June 22nd, and it's currently only $50 a year right now, and that will go up to $100 a year. So if you were interested in joining and becoming a part of this new global industry association of sorts, you can go to thepodcastacademy.com and go ahead and sign up.
And one of the great things about this industry right now is we're about 6 months into this global pandemic, and this is one of the few industries that's actually been continuing to grow in many respects, both in terms of, you see job postings out there, you see new shows starting. We've been growing. There's been a lot of growth in this industry in spite of the downturn. Yeah,
I agree with you 100%. I mean, we've seen content growth like we've never seen before. I mean, I think over the last 3 or 4 months, we've seen, 100,000 new podcasts come into the medium each month. So, I don't know how long some of those shows are going to last, but it's just been an explosion as people have, been forced to stay home. They've had extra time. They're not getting in their car commuting every day. So they have extra time, and a lot of people want to create something for themselves. And it is possible to create a business around podcasting. And
I think that's great.
Are trying to pursue that.
I think that's great. The more the merrier. It's delivered such tremendous value to my life over the last 10 years. I've met such amazing people. And so I tell everyone that they should do it. Anything else before we wrap things up? Anything else that we haven't touched on that you want to share, that you're keeping an eye on in terms of the industry or the medium, that you want to share with the listeners?
Yeah, I think we're in a phase right now of us getting clear and getting focused on what are the best experiences around podcast advertising and how we count podcasts. We've been going through a process since about 2014 of creating a standard around podcast measurement and how to measure downloads and what the proper methodologies are for that, and coming across with a global standard way of doing that, that the advertising industry recognizes. And the industry's been working with the IAB, which is it's an advertising based technology organization that focuses on coming up with best practices in digital advertising. And so the industry has been working with that for many years now, and we have a standards based platform that podcasts hosts can get certified with the way that they count downloads. And we have that today. And so that's really exciting. And so that's building a solid base on the advertising side for those that want to build an advertising based podcast. A lot of larger companies are wanting to do that. But that's not the only way you can monetize in this medium. There's donation models. There's doing it to support other business activities that you have. There's branded podcasts. But it's really going mainstream right now. So it's an exciting time, and it's not too late to start a show, in my opinion.
And on the downloads piece, big caveat: if you check your downloads, I actually don't check my downloads because it's kind of like grades. Like it's never going to be quite what you want it to be, unless you're an A+ student, right? It's never quite good. So personally, I just don't check them because for me, it's really just it's not a metric that really I found has influenced. I don't want to hold me back from using the podcast the way that I have. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think it depends on the goals of what you're doing your podcast for. I mean, if you're doing it to network with others and build your professional reputation and things like that, I'm not sure that the numbers mean a lot. I think it can be, and I learned this very, very early in my activities in podcasting too. It was about my professional development. And it was, sure, if I could make some money from it, it was great. But if I could build a reputation in my career and I could meet really cool and smart people and learn from them, that was enough of a reward. So I think that there's a lot of motivations to doing this medium, not the least of which is honing and developing your ability to present to others in large groups. And I think now more than ever, your ability to get on a camera like this on a video and come across professional and know what you're talking about is one of the most valuable professional skills that you can have now, I believe.
Right. Especially when we're all at home in sweatpants. So,
it's
very important.
Or less.
Or less. Exactly. Right. Well, I want to wrap things up and I didn't prepare you. I apologize. I forgot to, I usually warn my guests beforehand, but I think you can handle this last question that I'm going to ask. Yeah, sure. And that is, especially because you are the head of an organization that gives out awards. So let's pretend we're at an award show. And you were inducted to the Hall of Fame, so you're probably prepared for this. But what I want to know is when you get an award like that for lifetime achievement, who do you thank? Who are the mentors? Who are the friends? Who are the peers? Who are the other podcasters? In addition to family and friends, which of course they count too, but who else out there would you acknowledge in your remarks?
Well, I think that is such a big question because there are so many elements, especially if you're talking specifically about podcasting. Every interaction that you have doing your podcast is contributing to your success. So you really should thank everyone that has anything to do with your podcast. But I do think at the end of the day, you have to have support of your family and you have to have support of your friends in order to keep it going. Because for many podcasters in the early days, it's difficult to keep going. So, and I do have a train going by, but
quite all right.
And it's difficult to keep going, and so you need the encouragement of a spouse or a girlfriend, or you need to have that support layer because there's going to be times when you're not going to feel like doing the show, and you're not going to feel like that anybody's listening, especially in the early days. So I think thanking everyone and being appreciative for everyone that is supportive of what you're doing and contributes to what you're doing, I think is the right thing to do, because there can be, you'll be amazed when you start a podcast how many people you connect with and how that changes your viewpoint in life in general. It can be extremely I've seen it happen so many times with other people, is that it just completely transforms their lives. And so being thankful to everyone that was involved in that process, I think is the right approach.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Rob Greenlee from Libsyn and the Podcast Academy. Where can people go learn more about you, Rob, or connect with you?
Well, I do have a website at robgreenlee.com, and that's with 4 E's. So it's robgreenlee.com. And I also am pretty active on Twitter. So if you're an active participant in Twitter, go over and check out that. I talk a lot about podcasting over there, and that's just at Rob Greenlee with my full name. And I'd say, and if you want to send me an email, you're certainly welcome to do that if you have a question about podcasting or if it can help you with anything. And this is something I've done for years and years and years in the medium, and that's Rob G, and that's ROB and the letter G at Libsyn.com. And feel free to send me an email.
And I've been using Libsyn since the very beginning for 10 years now, and recommend to all of our clients to use it. It's an amazing tool. So they've made a great contribution. In addition to all the other companies out there, Libsyn really deserves credit for everything that they've done to help build up this industry. So it's a great company for you to join forces with. And I'm excited for where it leads in the future.
Well, and we have a new version of Libsyn coming out later in the year called Libsyn 5, which we're very excited about. It's going to modernize the platform and create a much better kind of user experience around creating podcasts.
That's exciting. Cool. I'm looking forward to that. All right, Rob, thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Cochrane. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
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 And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.